Hello, Brad here, just to say we're super proud that the Friday 5pm podcast is sponsored by the Malt Miller, the UK's best home brew store.
We use the Malt Miller for all of our homebrew experiments, as well as tapping them up for advice and binging on their awesome YouTube channel all the time.
That's why whenever we release a homebrew video, we put a recipe kit live on the Malt Miller, so you can brew with the exact same amazing ingredients that we did. The same ingredients used by pro brewers.
So alongside the Malt Miller's nitro-flushed hops, cold-stored yeast and milled-to-order malts, you can pick up recipe kits for our 5 Points Best Bitter, Russian River West Coast IPA, and now the fastest beer in the world, a hazy session IPA that goes from grain to glass in less than 48 hours.
Sign up to their newsletter at tinyurl.com/Malt Miller to get 5% off your first order. With the Malt Miller's amazing customer service and Jonny's 48-hour recipe, you could order the ingredients on a Monday and be drinking the beer by the weekend.
Speaking of which, it's Friday.
It's 5pm.
So enjoy this week's Friday 5pm podcast.
Hey Beer Geeks, and welcome back to The Bubble.
Yes, a slightly delayed bubble. There's a lot going on at the moment, isn't there, Johnny?
There's some news I've heard.
It's best just to avoid the news, but thanks to the wonders of technology, we have managed to remain socially isolated, but link up with the wonderful Pete Brown.
Yeah, so Pete Brown is, to be honest, one of the reasons I got into beer. I read his book, Man Walked Into a Pub, probably about a decade ago, and absolutely loved it, having always been a real ale and a Guinness fan, which is a brand we talk about today. But the main reason we wanted to talk to him is because of his history as an ad man, as a madman.
Yeah, he's a bit of a modern day Don Draper, but only less whiskey.
Yeah.
You may notice my absence in this episode, listeners. This is due to the wonders of technology. So I was listening in, but my microphone was not playing ball. So we've managed to edit me out. So my input was minimal, and I got to listen along. But I was really fascinated listening to Pete in this one. I love sort of old school advertising, and it was something that I was a little bit involved in a previous life. So listening to him talk about brands like Stella and Guinness, things that really resonate, and from growing up watching telly and seeing these amazing ads, I just found super interesting.
Yeah, I think we can agree that the adverts that were put out, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, before that whole lad culture kind of took over the beer market, we were producing much better adverts than we were beer.
Yes, very much. So like Guinness ads especially, I still remember all of them. There's the dancing man, the horses. There's so many of these really, really iconic ads that just live with you. And if you're lucky enough to be a Northern Irish listener, you may remember a very strange harp ad from around the early 90s. And it had Lawrence of Arabia coming in on a sort of cartoon camel and said, "I'll have a pint of harp and a packet of dates, please." So we'll put a link in the bio for that ad, because it's definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, so the creativity went out of beer before it did out of the adverts. And Pete was involved in lots of very famous campaigns for Stella Artois back in the day, before he sort of fell in love with beer writing, and then off the back of that fell in love with craft beer as that movement happened. So we have a good chat with him about the campaigns he was involved in, why beer advertising went so incredibly wrong, and now what we can learn from what craft brewers are doing, what the big guys can learn from what craft beer is doing, and perhaps where it might be headed to some extent, and where the budgets that were previously ploughed into cinematic epic adverts go now.
So without further ado, over to Pete Brown talking about advertising and beer.
Oh, I think it's got a yeast infection. Yeast infection.
Yeah, so Pete, we'll get to what you do as a beer writer and that kind of stuff, I'm sure, towards the middle and end of the podcast. But I wanted to start by talking about your previous life.
Yes.
As a corporate media, was it? I've already forgotten what the job title was. Strategic planner.
Yes, in an advertising agency.
Yeah. So tell me what a strategic planner is and what you did for that advertising agency.
The short answer is that I helped make adverts for Stella Artois and Heineken, and that's why I'm here today. But what a planner does is if you want the creative guys to write a really good ad, then you have to give them focus. And what a planner does is give them one sheet of paper. Which says, this is who we're talking to. This is the one single message the ad has got to say. This is why people should believe it. And this is the kind of tone of voice we're thinking of. And the creative works off that and comes up with a 30-second work of art on the back of it. But to get to that bit, you've got to boil down everything you know about the brand, the market, trends, the consumer, any insights you've got into why people think the way they do, shop the way they do, all that kind of stuff. And boil that down into that one sheet of paper and everything that happens. And then you've got to research the ad and make sure it works. And if it hasn't worked, figure out why. And if it has worked, figure out the same thing and do it again. And people are very strange. People are weird. People don't do the things they say they do. They don't even do the things that they think they do. So it's kind of like bringing applied psychology into a commercial process and playing with people's minds in return for making lots of money.
And so how did you fall into that?
It was beer that made me want a job in advertising. So I was a teenager. I became of legal drinking age in the mid-'80s. And beer ads were the best thing on telly at the time. A lot of the kind of alternative comedians hadn't gotten to TV yet. There was kind of fairly shit sitcoms. And beer ads were these little 30-second branded jokes, basically, and sometimes they were genius, and sometimes they had really great production values and stuff. Because you couldn't talk about the effects of beer, you couldn't talk about the reasons why people drink beer, so you had to. And the all lagers all tasted the same anyway, and so it was about building brands based on affinity, And if you made the funniest ad, you got the best audience, basically. And so I thought, when I was at university, and everyone was saying, right, your next step is to be an accountant. And my then girlfriend got some forms, and I was like, what, you mean I can actually get a job making those ads? So I applied to it late in the day, and it took me about 6 years then to home in on a job where I was making beer ads. And that set me on the path to becoming a writer.
So tell me, before we get onto the writing, tell me what the ads. Can you remember some of the ads that got you inspired from when you were 14?
My favourite one of all time, and I met the bloke who wrote it, and I went complete fanboy on him. I didn't know what had hit him. There's an old Carling Black Label ad of Dam Busters, and the Lancaster bombers are coming in over the dam. It's shot like a black and white war movie. And they drop a bouncing bomb onto the water, and it skips across the water. And there's a lone German sentry, and he takes off his overcoat and drops his rifle, and he saves the bouncing bomb like he's a goalkeeper and throws it back into the water. And then they drop like 10 bouncing bombs at a time, and he saves them all. And then one of the pilots takes his mask off and goes, "I bet he drinks Carling Black Label." And that's that was the gag, the punchline at the end of each ad, really. And then the little extra gag at the end is, the distortion that pilots get when they're wearing those oxygen masks in war films. It's like, so the guy takes his mask off and says something, and he still talks like that. And it's just a perfectly executed little gag. The thing about writing an ad is every single frame is considered and obsessed over, and that ad just didn't put a foot wrong. Might be a bit dated now, but it was just, at the time, it was just like, yeah, that's a brilliant joke, and I never get tired of watching it.
I was going to say the Portman Group wouldn't be happy with the use of bombs in any kind of beer advertising now.
Well, this is the thing now. I mean, around the time that I was working on ads, it wasn't the Portman Group. It was I think it's now called Clearcast. It changed its name every time. It's a different authority that looks at TV and radio advertising. And in 97, 98, they really tightened the rules up. So before then, you could use allegory. It's like, we're not seriously saying that if you drink Carling Black Label, you can catch massive bombs and stop them from going off. But then in about 97, 98, they tightened the rules to say, no, you are saying that. There's no such thing as hyperbole and allegory and things like that. If you're showing a man in a beer ad performing superhuman feats, you are claiming that this beer will make you perform superhuman feats. So it just got really stupid. And that was overnight the death of those great funny beer ads.
Do you remember what led to that?
It was the same time as it was when the term binge drinking. It was when binge drinking became the moral panic of the age. I was writing once. I did some research. There's a database of newspapers called LexisNexis, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but a few years later, I did some research on it, and the words binge drinking were mentioned in the Times, I think 3 times between 1785, when the Times was first published, and 1995. And then I think in the year 1998, the term binge drinking was in the Times 380 times in 1 year.
So more than once a day.
Yes. So there was just this moral panic around. A few years before that, it was ravers and travellers and things like that. A few years after that, a few years later, it's like asylum seekers. There's always this kind of group of people who are going to destroy society. And around that time, it was people who drank lager.
So I'm a huge fan of Mad Men, the TV show.
Yeah.
And a huge part of one of the seasons is around the ad men battling with the fact that cigarettes are basically being shut down.
Yeah.
And they can't make any claims about it. They can't really advertise it at any point. Was that how it felt, that wherever you turned at that point, there was no way to advertise and you had to get cleverer?
Yeah, it wasn't quite to the extent of cigarettes, and it's still not. But it was, when that kind of noose is tightening around advertising, from the 70s to the 90s, it actually inspired creativity. It's like, okay, you can't mention this, you can't mention this, you can't mention this, and you still got to somehow make this look appealing. And so it actually is a huge boost to someone's creativity to make them jump through those hoops. But then when it just got a lot tighter, there was nothing you could do apart from show a pack shot. In France, I think you're not allowed to have people in a beer ad now. And so the industry is always, we used to talk about it in terms of going black or going dark. The idea that you just can't say anything. The beer industry has been planning on that for 20 years now.
So how did you start to produce these pitches for the creatives? Was it investigations that you were doing? Was it other companies that you were buying data from? Was it a bit of everything?
It was a bit of everything, and it was just such a brilliant job. It really was when it went well. So the client gives you a brief. The client says, right, we've had our marketing budget signed off for the next 12 months, and we want to make a TV ad that we want to run in March and June, and then put any money we've got left into a pre-Christmas burst. And you go, okay, fair enough, we're making a TV ad, and you say, right, so what should we kind of go with the same message we did last time? What's changed since the last ad? Looking at market data, are more people drinking? Are less people drinking? Analysing drinkers, it's like, what are their behaviours? What do they look for in a beer brand? All that kind of stuff. Looking at data on how did the last ad perform? Competitive reviews, what's everybody else doing? What's the big stuff in the market? So you go into a huge amount of depth and detail, and you buy market data off other companies. You can use professional researchers to do focus groups, but I was a trained focus group moderator as well, so I would sometimes do them myself. And then there's a bit that I used to love of just kind of mining the data just to see what it told you. Graphing it in different ways, running different statistics against each other. You do a graph with something like, well, here's what beer sales did. Here's when we ran our ads. So you can see a spike there, but this spike's really bigger. Oh, if we put temperature onto this graph, we can see that bigger spike was due to a heat wave. And so you're always kind of looking stuff like that. My favorite thing was there's a database called TGI, and people fill out a questionnaire that's like 100 pages long that asks everything you can think of. And then you can cross-reference every answer they give. And so you can find out that Volvo drivers are more likely to eat Wall's sausages than Audi drivers. Or you can find out that Sun readers are more likely to holiday in the Algarve, whereas Guardian readers are more likely to holiday in Benidorm, or things like that. As you get some quite interesting little matchups and find stuff out that's counterintuitive. And I'd lose myself in that kind of thing for days.
So I'm really interested to know what campaigns you worked on and what the impetus was for those campaigns. So what did you do for Stella Artois?
So that was kind of the easiest job in the world, because at the time Stella was growing by about 30% year on year. Do you remember the Jean de Florette style ads that were set in Provence? And they were really cinematic. And they were just doing brilliantly. We spent half the amount of money that Budweiser did, and we had twice the advertising awareness that Budweiser had. So these ads were really cutting through. And they made drinkers feel like they were cleverer. It's almost impossible to imagine now. My very last day on the job was the first day I ever heard the term wife beater. And up to that point, people really thought Stella was a premium lager. And it wasn't a bad lager, actually, at one point. But I worked on an ad called Last Orders, which has got a dying father making his last requests. And he asks his son to go and get him some honey. So the son goes and gets some honey out of a hive, and he wants some blossom from a tree. So he climbs up the tree to get that. And he brings the blossom back, and and there's all these relatives crowding around waiting for the end. And then the dying father kind of gasps out, "Une Stella Artois." And so everyone has to put all their money together, every single penny they've got. And he goes and buys a pint of Stella, gets a lift back on a van, and then gives it to temptation and drinks it. Returns home with an empty glass, and then tries to blame it on the vicar who's performing last rites. And then the dad jumps up at the end, and he wasn't ill at all.
Wow, a real twist at the end.
Yes, it's better when you see it than when I'm describing it. You can see it on YouTube. And it looked beautiful. It was shot by Jonathan Glazer, who went on to make some really brilliant films. The guy who did Sexy Beast. And what's that Scarlett Johansson one where she's the alien serial killer? He shot that as well. So it was kind of proper cinematic directors, and it was great getting to work with those guys and stuff. And then it's
interesting because these days, so firstly, Reassuringly Expensive was bold anyway. I can't remember the last campaign I saw where it said, like, this is expensive. Usually we're sort of in discount booze territory. But the other thing is, those kind of adverts are not used in alcohol anymore, except for Peroni, which is still having huge success.
Oh, at first, Peroni was just copying Stella ads. We won the kind of Oscars of the advertising world are the Cannes Awards, as in south of France. And one campaign I worked on was it won the Grand Prix for print advertising at Cannes that year. And it was a bunch of luxury premium objects like a vintage Gibson guitar, an Eames chair, a luxury sports car, which had all got big scratches down them, and a bent Stella bottle cap at the bottom. So people had been using the most expensive things they could find to kind of open their Stella bottles on. So it was really one of those. Really, you had to look at it and figure out what was going on. They looked fantastic, and we won amazing prizes for it. And it was all about setting up this beer as being so expensive, so desired that people would do anything to get hold of it. That was the point. And then Stella reached a certain size in the market, and they said, right, balls to that. Let's now go as big as we can. Forget the expensive thing, forget the premium thing, forget the quality thing. Let's just get as many drinkers as we can. And the first ads I remember for Peroni just blatantly nicked that campaign that I was talking about. They just had Italian style icons in them. They even shot the same as Stella. And Stella just let them do it. Stella just let them take that position as the super premium lager in the mainstream lager market. It was a disaster.
So obviously, Stella Artois, and you were using the price to premiumize this. Now we don't necessarily use price in the craft beer world. We're more using scarcity.
Yeah.
But is there anything that smaller producers, craft beer producers, could learn from the advertising that was going on while you were in that world?
I think it's the other way around, to be honest. I think that big brands can learn from how smaller brands have. I mean, to some extent, I hope they don't. But smaller brands have used what they've got. They haven't got the multi-million-pound budgets or anything like that. But what they do have is this kind of nimbleness, this agility that big brands don't have. So a Stella ad would take us between 18 months and 2 years to make, just because it had to be so carefully researched and discussed and debated at every single point. Sometimes you'd watch a rough cut of a commercial 20 or 30 times a day, in kind of agonizing over every single frame, like I said. And the way that craft beer moves, I think the thing kind of one of my pet phrases at the moment is that craft beer is now the biggest sort of thing. It's driving global beer volume overall. And it happened without the permission of these vast, gigantic corporations. So I think it's the other way around. Yeah, I think it's that the big guys can learn from the craft guys.
We recently did a podcast with the former fashion editor of GQ, in which we kind of asked a similar question, and he gave the same answer, which is that the big fashion houses have started employing the people who are responsible for the success of these streetwear brands. Obviously, it's a bit more difficult because they'd have to employ both the marketing teams and probably the production teams to get the same effects, although increasingly that's getting less likely. I'm sure Camden and Heineken, Camden and Beavertown, that's awkward, sort of hoovering up these creatives as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I still do a lot of consultancy work with the big guys. Well, not as much as I would like, to be honest. But it's interesting how it's changing. Craft is changing the very fabric of those organisations. So when I was working on Stella and Heineken, my clients, if you like, the brand managers, the people responsible for working with the agency, they would be career marketers. So they would have started at Procter & Gamble working on soap. They'd have gone to Coca-Cola. They'd be spending 3 years as a brand manager on Stella or whatever. Then their next job would be marketing director of Whole Foods or pet food or something like that. They weren't into beer, and they didn't know about beer, and they didn't want to know about beer. They weren't interested in the product. Most of them didn't drink beer, and that was one of the things that enraged me. Was you could work on beer not knowing anything about it. When I worked on financial services, I had to learn how mortgages and pensions worked inside out. And when I work with people like, say, Guinness these days, and I meet people in the same positions, and they're mad, passionate craft beer fans, and they were craft beer fans before they joined Guinness. So the big companies have now got people who actually give a shit about beer working for them, which may not be good news for smaller brewers in terms of how they can compete, but overall, I think it's. I always think when I'm thinking about the business side of things, the marketing side of things, I always have kind of two answers in my head, like as a consumer and as an industry pundit. Well, three answers: an industry pundit, a consumer, and a passionate supporter of craft breweries, small scale breweries. And it's things look very different if you're a punter than if you're someone who supports the movement, really.
Yeah, how do you sort of justify that in your head when you're giving advice that might end up harming small brewers or reducing choice for consumers? It must be, because I do consultancy as well, not generally with big guys, but occasionally you're sat there giving advice that will hurt somebody else.
Yeah, I think it's an issue. I mean, some of the projects I work on would be, I would feel bad about it if I thought they were going to go anywhere. And,
right.
And often I'm like, right, we're gonna launch actually no one has said this to me, to be fair, but we're gonna launch a craft brand that's gonna destroy craft beer. It's like, well, no, you're not, because people what people used to say to me 20 years ago was, how do we do a Stella Artois? And I used to say to them, you launch a brand into the market that nobody wants. You don't change it. You don't do anything to it. You accept 20 years of minimal sales, and then wait for a new generation to come along who think that's always been there. It's always been consistent. It's never changed. I can probably trust that brand. It's more authentic than the others. And they went, well, we can't do that. We need to bring it to market in 18 months. And the simple conversation is like, how do we launch a craft beer that's going to kill all the small craft beer guys? And I say, really easy. All you do, you let your brewer do whatever he wants. and you don't put it through any market research, you don't put it through your normal gate system of approvals, and you just launch it onto the market as soon as he's brewed it and as soon as the brewer's happy with it. And they go, well, we can't do that. And I say, well, you can't launch your craft beer then. I get paid for that, so I'm fine.
And it sounds dismissive, but that is what is happening at 2,500 breweries around the UK.
Yeah, and I was just an example when I was working with Stuart Ross. I wasn't working with him. I was drinking and getting pissed with him. Before he,
it's a fine line sometimes.
Before he was poached to start up Magic Rock, he brewed in a brewery at the Hillsborough Hotel in Sheffield. He had a brewery that he'd built himself out of junk in the basement. And this is why Magic Rock beers are so good. It's like what Stuart did when he got some proper gear was amazing. And he was walking around Sainsbury's, and there was these boxes full of chilies reduced to clear because they're coming towards the end of their usefulness. And so on the spot, he just went, I'm going to make a chili porter. And so he bought these massive boxes of chilies and brewed a chili porter the following morning, and it was gorgeous. Now, if I was to do a new product development workshop with a multinational brewer, and we said, shall we do a chili porter? That would take 2 years to bring to market. By which time, if there had been a market for, if I'd done the research and said, you want to be launching a chili porter, that research would be 2 years out of date by the time they actually got it to market. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that small brewers have got the advantage these days. This is why I think it's not, I mean, this conversation has kind of receded a little bit now, but when a big corporation buys a beloved craft brand, and the first instinct is people going, well, they're going to bugger up the beers now. They're going to make it corporate. They're going to ruin what was special about it. I don't think that is the default. That can still happen, and I can think of one example in particular where it definitely has happened. But it's not the default position now, because the reason they're buying those breweries is that they can't replicate what the brewer has done. So it's just simpler to pay them over the odds for what it costs to buy the brewery, and say, right, we don't know how you do it, we don't know what you're doing. Carry on doing whatever it is you do that we don't understand, and we'll just give you some more fermenting vessels so you can scale up production, and give you an aggressive, nasty sales force to get your product into more places.
It's interesting also the effect that craft beer has had in that I think it has stopped people being able to do what you said that happened with Stella, 20 years of unremarkable sales, and then suddenly it's a retro brand. Yeah. You've seen things like Hofmeister try to come through doing that. Perhaps Blue Ribbon nearly had another moment. Red Stripe nearly had another moment. But is it harder now to break through and make your brand sort of authentic when there is actual authenticity now?
Well, there's so much noise now. So there's so many more brewers and brands around, and at the same time, the channels through which you communicate have gone apeshit. So in the 80s, when I was getting into my beer ads, my TV ads. Sorry, I'm just pouring myself another beer here.
Of course.
In the 80s, when I was getting into my beer ads, there were 2 commercial channels on everyone's television. Coronation Street would get 20 million viewers. And they said to break a Coronation Street, most of the country was watching. So you dropped a beer ad in there, and anybody you wanted to see saw it. I mean, if you think about good TV ads these days, you think about the John Lewis ads, which are the only TV ads that anyone really talks about these days. It's all about online. People. It's about making the ad so good that people talk about it on social media, and they go to YouTube to watch the ad. There's just no point advertising on TV anymore, really, because no one's going to see it. So the landscape's changed completely. And if you've got that diverse, fractured audience, it's so much harder to reach and to get them to pay attention to you. And you've got 1,000 times more people trying to do it. After we got those tighter regulations at the same time as this huge fragmentation in the channels and the sort of dissolving of the mass audience. What all the big brewers did was they put all that budget into price discounting in supermarkets. And so in the late 90s, when I was doing focus groups with drinkers, say, for example, you'd get a bunch of lads and they were either Bud drinkers or they were Stella drinkers, and never the twain shall meet. It was like a tribal thing. It was Crips versus Bloods. And 10 years later, they were like, well, the same lads would be, well, I buy anything, whatever's on the best offer at the supermarket. Foster's, Heineken, Stella, they're all the same. Which one's got the best deal this week in the supermarket? So they actually, the industry, the big beer industry itself deliberately destroyed all that brand loyalty that they'd spent 30 years building up. It was basically the biggest act of self-harm that any industry has ever seen from a marketing point of view. So no one's loyal to those brands anymore. I mean, people still drink them and buy them, but they buy them just on price. They're commoditized, and took all the kind of meaning out of what these brands are and what they had. And I do think that's one of that kind of opened the door for craft to come in, because people were no longer brand loyal, brand specific. So that meant they were much more likely to try something they'd never heard of before.
So you think the marketing budget's gone into discounting rather than content production?
Totally.
And interestingly, Guinness have probably been the last to abandon that traditional model of beautifully made, story-led, funny adverts.
Well, if you ask me as a marketing professional rather than a beer drinker, Guinness is by far my favourite beer brand at the moment. I just think they're doing it absolutely right. And I can think of 3 decent beer TV ads this century, and 2 of them are Guinness ads.
Which were they?
Do you remember what's it called? The one with the guys in, is it? Yeah, the guys in Africa who are like really poor, but they dress up in these amazing costumes and go dancing.
Of course, yeah. I can't remember the name of them. Yeah,
Sappers. That's what it is. And that's just a glorious piece of film. It really, really is. And the other one is with guys in wheelchairs playing basketball, crashing over and all sorts of stuff. And then at the end of the basketball game, all of them, apart from one guy, get up and walk away and say, right, see you next week, mate. And so they've all been playing basketball in wheelchairs because their mate is in a wheelchair, which just is the most amazing thing. And then they're both kind of executions on this strapline of made of more, which is just a brilliant, brilliant positioning for a brand like Guinness. I think they've been through their troubles and they're not out of the woods, but I think they really get it.
I love that stuff. Been drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. You know, I heard they recently decided to add more hops to it. You know, I heard they recently decided to add more hops to it.
So let's move on to the other side of what you do, Pete. So you were working for this advertising agency, doing beautiful marketing for shit beer. When did you start wanting to get involved in shit marketing for great beer?
I mean, it led directly out of what I was doing. So I've mentioned quite a few times the focus groups and stuff, and it was that really. It was all the stuff I had to do, understanding the psychology of beer drinkers, and I enjoyed it. This may come as a shock, but I enjoyed it a lot more than doing the same thing on financial services or newspapers or anything like that. I just thought it was fascinating, and like I said, the brand loyalty at that time was absolutely astonishing. I'd never seen anything like it, apart from maybe people's football teams. So I'd never seen the kind of passion expressed over choice of beer in any other product. And so I started thinking, well, why is this? Why does beer have this hold over people's imaginations like this? Why are people so loyal to it? So I went looking for a book about the social and cultural history of beer. And I found one in the States that was brilliant in terms of a history of beer from a marketing perspective in the States. And no one had written one in the UK. So I was going, I can't believe no one's written this book. This is just stupid. And I woke up one morning and went, excellent, I'll write it. And that was Man Walks Into a Pub. And Man Walks Into a Pub was going to be a chapter on each one of these classic campaigns and how it had helped shape culture and stuff, with a quick introduction on the history of beer. And then the history of beer turned into 2 chapters and then 3 chapters. And by the time I finished the book, it was a book on the history of beer with 1 chapter on beer advertising.
Yeah, that is how I read it as well. You were describing that at the start. I was like, that's not the book I remember.
And that was it. The book came out, and suddenly I realised there was a whole kind of beer writing world. And So I decided to, when Man Walks, actually the week Man Walks Into a Pub came out, my mate who I used to work on Stella with, by this time was doing the same. He was kind of marketing manager at MTV, and he got us backstage camping at Glastonbury 2003. And so I'm camping backstage at Glastonbury, and the only celebrity I saw was Keith out of The Office, the big guy out of The Office, camping near us. And they had 3 copies of The Guardian, and my publicist had said, I think you might be being reviewed in The Guardian this weekend. And it came out as a trade paperback, first edition. So I looked at the paperback reviews in the Guardian review section. It wasn't there. I thought, oh, well, never mind, And so I started reading the review section from the beginning, and I had a full-page review, glowing review of Man Walks Into a Pub on page 5 of the Guardian. And I thought, I'm sitting at Glastonbury reading a full-page glowing review of my first book, and I went into work the following week. They were asking for voluntary redundancies, and I went, yep. That's me. I'm quitting advertising. I'm going to be. And they went, we didn't mean you. I went, oh, shit, mate, I'm off. And so I did freelance advertising for quite a bit of time, but I'd always wanted to be a writer since the age of 9, and I never thought I was going to be a beer writer. But that book came out, and getting that review just made me realise that all the kind of jockeying for position and promotion and power games and advertising, I totally wasn't interested in any of it. I wanted to write, and I'd found the thing I could write about. So that was it.
What was the demand like back then? Because you say, so I wrote the book. Surely, who was commissioning a book about the history of beer?
Well, I always say you're not a writer. Certainly, you're not a writer of books until you've collected a folder full of at least 13 rejection letters from publishers. So I think I got to about 20. But at the time, there were all these narrative non-fiction books. Have you seen a book called The History of Cod?
No.
Seriously, I know it sounds daft, but this guy, Mark Kolansky, he wrote The History of Cod. And I think it seemed like such a weird subject, but the whole point that he did was he used cod to tell the story of how the Viking fishing fleets probably discovered North America centuries before Columbus. He explored Basque culture and how Basque cod fishing works. And he used cod as basically a vehicle to write an incredible story about different groups of people around the world. So it was about the people. And it won so many prizes. It was a massive bestseller. And off the back of that, there was the history of the English lawn, the history of bold sweets, the history of the colour purple, and excuse me, and I couldn't believe that no one had done beer. So my book, I lifted the approach for the history of cod, and did one about beer, and got all my rejections. And then Pan Macmillan, there was an editor who I later found out had been thinking exactly the same thing as me. He said, why isn't one? It's like, right, we've done every subject we can think of. No one's done beer yet. And he wanted to commission one on beer. And my proposal landed on his desk that morning. And that was it. It was pure luck. It was pure chance. It usually is when something like that happens.
And what was the state of beer writing back in 2003?
It was... I can tell you what I thought it was. I've since been proved... I've since discovered I was wrong, to some extent. But I was. Excuse me, hang on. At the time, I gathered as much beer writing as I could find, and most of it was basically Michael Jackson or Roger Protz. And there was this format of book, the World Encyclopedia of Beer, Beers Around the World, Beers of the World. And they would all have an introduction chapter on why beer is so great, a brief potted history of beer, a description of how beer is made, and then it'd be like, right, these are the best beers in each country as you go around the world. And everybody was just kind of Xeroxing that format. And it was just like, what's the point of this? And beer writing in Britain was lager is shit, camera saved the world, real ale is the only beer you need to drink, the end. And so I was quite iconoclastic coming in, writing about mainstream lager. I was deliberately aggressive about it. I deliberately went in right into camera's face and wound them up to the point that we almost got into illegal tussle about it. The first edition of Man Walks Into a Pub was quite scathing about some of the beer writers. And then, of course, as I get into the industry, I find out I've been slagging off some really nice people and felt really bad about it. And also, my biggest mistake was I dismissed Michael Jackson's writing along with everybody else. I thought he was doing this same Me Too kind of stuff without actually reading his books properly and realizing what a fucking brilliant writer he was. Apart from the fact that he did everything first before anyone else did, the quality of writing still makes me jealous today, really.
Yeah, I recently wrote a piece on the formation of beer language, in which I reread the 2 Michael Jackson books I have, and it's lyrical. It's he says stuff about beer that I have never even considered, and he was doing it 20 years ago, and we seem to have forgotten a little bit how beautiful prose about beer can be, I think.
Yes, because he relates it to life. That's the point, I think. And that's what I try to do. It's what I aspire to doing. But he makes you think he'd be a great person to have a beer with. He doesn't try to. I mean, he's incredibly knowledgeable, but he doesn't try to shove his knowledge in your face. He tries to be avuncular and gentle. So you're learning stuff. He's very, very authoritative. But he's just great company on the page.
Yeah, I agree. It does feel like you're on a journey with him almost. It's not somebody sort of preaching to the choir.
Totally.
Yeah. So, alongside the beer writing, what kind of marketing was going on with the beers that would have been around in 2003? So back then, there would have been Meantime just about, Thornbridge literally starting. And obviously lots of breweries in America. Were you aware of any sort of attempts at marketing and PR?
Not at the time. I was still very much in my head. I was still very much lager boy. And I'd always been interested in what we later started calling craft beer. There was a brewery called Pete's Wicked Ale, a very early American craft beer that was on sale in odd bins. And I always used to buy some of that when I went in for a bottle of wine. But it was invisible to me. I mean, you had this kind of, you had the big campaigns from the lager boys, followed by the price discounting, and then you had the real ale brands, which didn't really have budget and just presented them almost an anti-marketing kind of image with no appeal whatsoever to a kind of a mainstream audience. I think people bought those brands in spite of the marketing rather than anything else. And then I think it all changed about 5 years after that with social media.
In terms of the drinkers sort of started to do the advertising themselves, or the breweries seizing it? Because I'm not aware of any real ale brands that do social media particularly well.
No, I think when you got the new brand of sort of self-defined craft brewers coming through, so what you got, the CEBA regulations, they got the progressive beer duty in 2001, and you can track from that point a huge growth in the number of breweries. But I remember at the time, as I was getting into beer properly from a product perspective rather than just a cultural perspective, you'd get, and I'd go down to Uto Beer and they'd say, right, we've just got a new range of beers in from this new brewery that's just opened up. Do you want to help us taste them and see if we should be stocking them? And you'd get a range of 6 or 7 beers, and they would all be between 3.8% and 4.2%. They'd all be traditional British beer styles. And so you got lots of brewers all making the same beer. And we're back to that these days, just with a different style. But around when social media came around, people started talking about beers, and the influence of America suddenly became very, very easy and accessible. And this growing number of brewers started experimenting with styles. I remember drinking a very early Thornbridge beer in 2005, which I found on a visit to the Peak District, and jumping up out of my chair going, this has got those American hops in that I've just heard about. And I hadn't tasted the beer in Britain like that ever before. I've since found out there were some, but they were pretty small and pretty thin on the ground. And so they get the American influence in, and social media starts to build its own scene. At the time, beer was completely excluded from mainstream media. It still doesn't get great representation. But the first generation of beer bloggers and brewers getting Twitter accounts from about 2009 onwards, it created what we've now got as the craft beer bubble. And from that, you start to get this new wave of marketing. I think most big beer brands, I think most good craft beer brands, from a marketing perspective and a product perspective, have built their brand on the back of a mix of social media and, horrible word that we use in the business, experiential. And once social media went mobile, once you get the smartphone in around 2009, 2010, you get people in pubs going, "Hey guys, I'm in this pub and the brewer from so-and-so's in here. They've done a tap takeover. Get yourselves down here. Oh, and here's some photos of it happening that I can share on social media." We completely take this for granted now. And that is that way of life that impacts everything that we do now is only 10 or 11 years old. It's almost impossible to remember what it was like before then. And I think people who've grown up with that and can't remember much different before it have an instinctive concept of brand marketing, and they would never call it brand marketing. To them, it's not. But if you kind of curate your tweets carefully, if you edit them carefully, if you're consistent with what you're tweeting about or Instagramming about, then you're doing brand marketing, basically.
It's interesting. I think a lot of beer geeks would try to claim that they see beyond marketing, beyond branding, and understand what's good by judging the liquid. And you look at, when Beavertown Gamma Ray came out, there were 10 other beers that were just as good. So why did Beavertown have the success that it did? And it comes down to Nick Dwyer and what he was putting on the cans, and to the people running the social media at the time. I think we're not immune to these marketing attempts. It's just they've shifted from TV to social.
I totally agree, and I may be wrong about this, and I know there are people who disagree with me, but I think that's precisely the reason for the difference between the outcry that greeted Beavertown selling 49% to Heineken, and a few months later, 4Pure selling 100% to Lion. I think they're comparable beers. I sort of rate them equally. I think they're similar styles. And Beavertown was like rending of garments, and it was horrible. And 4Pure, I did a check when I was writing about this, and I think there's a hashtag like Beavertown sellout or whatever, and it was like tens of thousands of tweets using this hashtag. And I searched for 4Pure sellout, and there was one.
Yeah, I mean, that's a measure of goodwill, of brand equity, isn't it? Right there.
It really is. Beavertown was a massive brand. It had built its brand differently than mainstream. It had built its brand by breaking all the rules about good branding. It's not supposed to work. But it's a good. There's a test we used to do where you would take the company name off a logo and the shape of the logo. It's like, do you know what these are? And it's like, yeah, there's the Nike swoosh, there's the Stella Artois coat of arms, there's the Coke bottle. I could name all those brands. And if you saw a Nick Dwyer drawing on the side of a building or the side of a van with no text whatsoever, any craft beer drinker would say, "Oh, that's Beavertown." It's an astonishingly good brand.
So you started a couple of years ago the Craft Beer Marketing Awards.
Well, the Beer Marketing Awards, yeah.
Oh, the Beer Marketing Awards. Sorry, put the C word in front of it. What was the impetus for that? Was that trying to raise the standards, or was that to celebrate what was being done, or?
It was a lot of what we've been talking about. If you think about the beer industry, there's a lot of brewing awards, as there should be, to celebrate the quality of the beer. In the advertising industry, there's lots of marketing awards, and no one had done both of them. And what I'm talking about the shift from big brand marketing to this small, nimble, adaptive marketing that's multimedia and doesn't necessarily need a great budget, we thought that was a really exciting time. If you tried to start the Beer Marketing Awards in 2000, it would have been whoever had made the best TV ad, and that would be it. But what we had in the Beer Marketing Awards was, I distinctly remember the second year, Purity had spent 50 quid on sponsoring a bike race, and Heineken had spent 10 million on either Euros or the Olympics, and they were the two finalists up against each other, because it's about the quality of the thinking, the quality of the idea. that counts. And Heineken eventually won because they did throw money at it, but they didn't just throw money at it. They did do some nice activations. But they were being pushed to the wire by a 50 quid campaign from Purity, and so we thought it was a great time to celebrate creativity in the beer industry. And because both Heineken and Purity could enter, we thought it's the only awards ceremony in the industry that applies to everybody. You know, the first year we had Budweiser, Camden, Purity, you know, tiny brewers all competing for the same awards. And so we thought it was the only awards ceremony that anybody in the industry could come to. So I mean, there was a genuine altruistic motive there. And also, you know, all the kind of horrors that you got on Pump Clip Parade and stuff like that. We wanted people to see that you could do great marketing without a massive budget and stop doing such terrible marketing that was giving beer a bad name. And also we thought we'd make some money out of it. And that's the only thing we were wrong about, basically.
So the awards happened last year, right? Are they happening this year?
They're not. They're on indefinite hiatus. So I launched the awards with 2 partners. We've done 5 editions of it now, and we haven't made a penny out of it. We've broken even. We've paid our running costs, but we haven't ever taken any salary out of it or for our time. And you know, I think there's a lot of people in this industry who do projects because they think they need to be done, and they're happy to do them for a while. And my 2 partners now are no longer in the industry anymore, so they're understandably not interested in carrying on. We tried to sell it as a going concern, but that hasn't worked out. So it may return next year in some shape or form. I am in conversations with people about it, but it's not happening for a little while.
So you recently wrote your first book that was outside of the beer industry, with the brilliant name of Pie Fidelity. That didn't get you such a glowing review in The Guardian, if I remember correctly.
Oh my God, that was a psychopathic character assassination.
It was, somebody had something to get off their chest, didn't they?
I've honestly been asked I've been asked many times whether I have slept with that guy's wife or run over his dog, because the venom in it was out of all proportion to a book about fish and chips and pork pies, basically.
But it was, now that I've heard what the origins of Man Walks Into a Pub was supposed to be, it feels like you did the same thing with food. So you took something that is kind of counter to what people in this country believe, and kind of championed it. So it wasn't macro lager. It was our slightly frowned upon food, traditional cuisine.
It was exactly the same. It was exactly the same approach. It's a very similar book. It's much better written than Man Walks Into a Pub, because I've had quite a lot of practice now. But it actually grew out of looking at our attitudes to beer. When I was working on lager, the whole point, the reason the Stella ads were like they were was, I'm only going to drink beer if it comes from another country. You know, I wouldn't drink a British beer. You know, we're talking about one of the greatest brewing nations on the planet. So, we only make real ale, and that's all shit. You know, I want to drink a lager, and lager's got to be made in continental Europe or Australia or somewhere. I wouldn't drink a British lager because that is going to be shit as well. And I thought, why? You know, if you talk to anyone else around the world, the British beer is just like amazing. And we're the only country in the world that doesn't rate British beer. We're also the only country in the world that doesn't rate our own beer. You know, if you go to speak to someone in Greece, they're going to say, well, Mythos is a fantastic beer. If you go to America, they're going to say Bud is a fantastic beer. Not one of the brands in the British top 10 beer brands is a British brand. Carling's Canadian. And I thought, well, that's just strange. And so I've been living with that for years, and then realised that our attitudes to food are exactly the same. Oh, British cuisine is shit. You know, British food is shit. And people who say, well, no, food in Britain's really good now. What they mean is, we've got access to all these amazing different cuisines from around the world, and we're really cosmopolitan, and you know, you can get Vietnamese food and Korean food and things like that. I'm like, yeah, but what about traditional British food? Oh yeah, that's terrible. And it's so not. You know, there's this whole we have the best climate for growing livestock and a lot of produce in the world. You know, we grow the best apples in the world. We have the best apple growing terroir in the world. And no one knows that. if you think of beef, you probably think of the best steak you could ever have. You probably think of Argentina and all those kind of South American. All those herds are British, descended from British cows, British livestock, and no one knows this. And it was an experiment to see if I could be proud and passionate about something Britain does well in the age of Brexit.
Yeah, it makes it tough, doesn't it?
While being a passionate Remainer myself, if I could find a way to be patriotic without sounding like Nigel Farage, basically.
And food was the medium. So you must have got involved slightly in the food scene as well as part of that. How does that compare to the beer sphere?
Oh, I was just trying to think about who might hear this. So the first thing I'll say is that the beer marketing, sorry, not the beer marketing awards, the Fortnum and Mason Food and Drink Awards. If you think beer writers can put it away, we are left standing by the wider universe of food and drink writers. They cane it like motherfuckers. I've never seen drinking like I've seen at the Fortnum and Mason party. It's just as cliquey as we are. It's just as trend-driven as we are. If we're all talking about New England IPA, there's an equivalent in the food world, which might be, what was it recently? So it's kind of Eastern European cooking. So it's like, what cuisine haven't we done yet, and that kind of. So it's quite bitchy. It's really interesting because I was welcomed into this broader food and drink world as like, oh, here's Pete, the beer and cider guy. Oh, it's great that we've got a beer and cider guy in. And I definitely put some noses out of joint by saying, oh, hey, now I've written a book about food as well. And it's like, oh, no, when you were the beer guy, we're not sure we want you on our turf now.
Yeah, talk but don't compete, please.
Yes.
Interesting. Well, it's good to know that we're not the only super cliquey, hypey food and drink scene out there. That's reassuring.
And none of us are as bad as the travel writers, by the way.
Is that right? Well, they're having a torrid time right now, so there we go. It's karma.
I drove over to the Sonic Drive-In, ordered a jalapeno burger, washed it down with beer, I said, Stone Cold, why have one when you can have them both?
So that was Pete Brown talking about advertising and books and his pretty interesting career.
He's been through, the whole gamut, the whole revolution of the craft beer movement, and seen basically his previous love of advertising just die on its arse, essentially. But it was interesting to talk about how the budgets are going into discount, but there's lots of free guerrilla marketing being done by these new beer brands. People like Beavertown, who have got fantastic brands, but also scarcity marketing, which I think is probably the dominant force in the guys doing really well at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it mad that these budgets that were so big of these huge ad campaigns from these big breweries now just goes into making it as cheap as possible. And it really is the sign of where beer lost its way, because there is no brand loyalty in big beer, really. Not in the same way there is for like clothing brands and lots of other sort of commodities. People don't really care if they go to Tesco's when they're picking their beer. They just want the cheapest one. So that was obviously the big sea change when there was more stricter advertising laws. So all these big breweries just decided, fuck it, we'll just make it as cheap as we can. And that's why craft beers really moved it forward and trying to make it a bit more interesting with their sort of guerrilla campaigns using social and scarcity to do that.
Yeah, so Guinness is still doing it very well. Peroni they've copied Stella Artois, but they've continued to do it pretty well. Estrella have started doing quite cinematic, epic adverts with is it Peter Dinklage, who's from Game of Thrones and some other things. There's some feature length adverts there, but otherwise nobody's doing it. So who are the guys doing marketing well, do you think, at the moment?
I mean, from the big guys or the small guys, I think from the big guys, you are right, and Pete has probably been involved in this, but I just think what Guinness do is so good. I mean, bias being Irish and all that, but I think their advertising has always been so strong, and how they've created a brand within Stout, like they have completely taken that market. They go down a nostalgic route. They sponsor the right events. They've just done a very, very good job in maintaining their market share.
And what about small guys?
Small guys, I mean, it's just so different, isn't it? What the small guys are doing, they're having to use social media and all these type of things to push their brands. People like Pilot are absolutely smashing it on Twitter. Like, don't take it seriously. There's a lot of people on Twitter who do sort of keyboard warriors that maybe do take it all a bit too seriously for an online presence, and they've done the exact opposite, and I love it.
Yeah, I did a podcast with the guy who runs the Pilot account for Good Beer Hunting, and we had a long conversation about what opportunities would have still been there for him if it weren't for the Twitter account. And he was very open in going, I interviewed him at the London Craft Beer Festival, and he said, I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for the Twitter account. Like, that's the main reason they have such a vocal presence in the beer industry. I think there's lots of breweries that are doing marketing very, very well, but again, they're doing it in a slightly guerrilla way. They're sort of, I guess you could call it greenwashing, but using sustainability, using independence as a form of marketing. So Purity, who make pretty decent beer, have built their entire brand off of being, and they're borderline carbon neutral. They only take, I think it's 2.5 pints to brew a pint of beer, which is around about 5 times less than your average brewery. And stuff like this, coupled with them being in their local football, Aston Villa, I think. They do all the beer in Aston Villa. Beavertown doing it at Tottenham Hotspurs. You've got Magic Rock at Huddersfield. And these ways of reaching people seem to be much more effective than the big content-led stuff. And then you do the free content-led stuff to talk about the things you're doing.
I think actually Harvey's are one of the first breweries in the country to be on every bar in a football stadium at Brighton and Hove. So
is that right?
They're the old school ones who are leading the charge there.
That is amazing. That's almost worth. I could be a Brighton player, but I'd like to go to their stadium now.
Yeah, smash a couple of bests. It doesn't get much better than that.
So I mean, I am always fascinated by beer marketing because we all think in the craft beer industry that we are totally focused on the quality, but we're not. We're all, myself included, Rob included, swayed by branding. And if you look at the biggest brands in the UK, none of them have bad branding. And while that might be because they're paying equal attention to their branding and their liquid, it also kind of implies that these most famous brands are top of our list because of the way they look. So it's always worth being critical, self-critical, to try and separate the image of a brand from its actual quality of its liquid, which we should be doing if we're beer lovers.
Yeah, I mean, the branding is important, and if you're going to drink a beer once, quite often the reason you pick that beer is because of how it looks, because you've got not a lot else to base it on, particularly if you're in like a busy pub or a bottle shop and you're just browsing the shelves. So something needs to stand out, and that's testament to Nick's work, as you guys discussed from Beavertown. Like, that was a loud can. Those colours really popped out of the fridge and it was intriguing. But the reason they did so well is because then the liquid was in it to back it up. And I think that's what all the breweries need to remember when they're creating these beers and these designs, that it's not just all style. You do need the liquid as well.
Yeah, and hopefully the drinkers will remember that too. Guys, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what Pete Brown had to say. You can get us at Beer Channel on Twitter, at Craft Beer Channel on Instagram, and obviously on YouTube at youtube.com/The Craft Beer Channel. Please do support our Patreon. That supports everything we're doing. It's ever more important now because YouTube advertising's down, sponsored content is down, and everybody's loving life. So if you do have some money to spare, do join our Patreon. Otherwise, we'll see you next month for another bubble, and we'll see you on next Friday. We'll see you next Friday with another Friday 5 p.m. with my man Brad.
Let's talk about beer, Johnny. Let's talk about AVB. Let's talk about Imperial Stouts and Imbibe buyouts of wicked weed. Let's talk about beer. Let's talk about beer. Let's talk about beer. Let's talk about beer.